Thank you so much, Dima. I hope that you can hear me well. I'd like to first Kaisid for playing a central role in bringing us together today, as well as Brigham Young University, Berkeley Center at Georgetown. It's wonderful to be together with so many friends and colleagues. Of course, we miss the opportunity to be in person in the same place and all of the wonderful conversations that allows us to have. But that cuts to the issue that we're here to discuss today, really, doesn't it? Because COVID-19 has interrupted every facet of our lives, and there is really nowhere to go to hide from it. It is across the globe. According to the data being tracked by the New York Times, as of today, there were over 38 million confirmed global cases and 1 million deaths for a disease that less than a year ago, no one knew about. And it's easy to imagine that many more cases have gone unrecorded. Despite an increase in understanding of this illness and a general feeling that we are moving in the right direction, perhaps towards finding some treatment, there is a restlessness that's pushing people, I think, back into community spaces now. And honestly, there are more recorded cases per day right now across the globe since the outbreak began. So we are still in a very grave situation, and it's getting worse. But even before COVID-19, the human community was already suffering from great disparities. Access to healthcare and life expectancies varied from community to community. Access to education, the digital divide. These created entirely different futures for some people than for others. Healthy food and potable water scarcity was a reality, even in cities in the most developed countries. And of course, as with time immemorial, identity conflicts raged across the world. Within the religious community, some voices have always sought ways for us to reimagine ourselves, our economies, even our humanity. The Jesuit priest and liberation theologian Ignacio Ellacuría wrote of a new economy that put sacred human dignity at its center, for example. The Buddhist master Thich Nhat Hanh explains the concept of codependent arising, in which all human life is woven together in a kind of interbeing that makes us understand how dependent we are on one another. But these calls to change our ways of thinking have often been met with resistance. Father Ellacuría, for example, was assassinated, along with his colleagues in San Salvador in the 80s. And Thich Nhat Hanh has been in exile from his home country of Vietnam since the Vietnam War era. So how do we reimagine a global community that seeks to elevate each and every one of us? Can this current crisis be turned into an opportunity where we are forced to recognize how connected we all are, that our fates and our interests are interdependent, and to seek ways to develop technologies and economies, forms of energy, education, and even work that are all focused on the dignity of each person, or in fact on the sacredness of life in general? Or will the fear and the danger that we experience pit us even more fiercely against one another, as we have seen with migrant communities, for example, that are increasingly rejected across the world, or a rise in authoritarian politics? And most importantly, for this conversation, what's the role of religion and the religious faithful in leading the effort for change? With over 8 in 10 of the world's people professing a religious affiliation, how do they already lead the way in supporting those vulnerable populations that are even more threatened as COVID strikes areas with poor health infrastructure and crippled economies? So today we have an exceptional panel of esteemed colleagues and professors and practitioners that would like to address some of these questions. And I will ask those who are in attendance to please go ahead and think about what's being said, derive questions for the panelists. We'll have plenty of time to address those questions. Feel free to put them in the chat function here on the program platform, and they will be curated and sent forward, and we will try to address as many of them as possible towards the end of the session. So what we will do is I'll introduce each speaker before they give their intervention, and we will save the questions to the end of the entire panel. So I appreciate that everyone is here, having a very rich discussion, and I would like to begin by inviting Dr. Mohammed Samak, who is the Secretary General of the National Committee for Christian-Muslim Dialogue in Lebanon and is a member of the CAICID Board of Directors, to please step forward and give us his intervention and his thoughts on these issues. Particularly, Dr. Samak, how can religious leaders find common ground with policymakers to support vulnerable groups during this crisis? Dr. Samak.
Dr. Samak, can you hear us?
Well, thank you, and thank you for this illuminating introduction to this subject. It's very complicated, but it's of a great interest. To start with, it is worth noticing that there is a gap between and politicals after the rise of religious extremism with its brutal and destructive consequences. This gap is unbridgeable. It is those caught up in between, vulnerable, who suffer most and highest price. Killing a human being by a bomb, a virus, is sick. Killing hundreds of persons, it is also of no difference. The killing is of sin or of a shortcut to heaven, that's a suicide attack. Religious leaders work together to win the battle of human fraternity. Political leaders get the credit. After all, as St. Paul put it, to the pure, all things are pure. That is, almost no one is pure. Political leaders are of two kinds. Leaders guide their people to, and populists who are guided by the mob of their people to what they think is good. Leaders are not mathematics. There are men who miss the name of manipulate religion. Beliefs are harder to shake than knowledge, and nothing is more firmly believed than that which is least known. Here again, the vulnerables are caught in between. Both political and religious leaders suffer from the same misconcept that they can do it alone and without any cooperation with the other, or even on the expense of the other. Our experience taught us that the vulnerables are best served if both political and religious leaders and their institutions work side by side for the common good. CAICID did it in different parts of the world before and after the pandemic, not only by being a bridge between them, but by playing the role of coordinator and mediator. Whether we look at ourselves through religious texts or through the UN Charter, the deep fact is that we humans are one family. Even the virus, COVID-19, realized this obvious and treated us accordingly. CAICID's strategy is based on this principle, that we are one family. After all, this is what our religions as the United Charter teach us, and this is what it is for in the first place. The great Greek historian Herodotus once said that the most hateful torment for men is to have knowledge of everything but power over. This is the deep of religious and political leaders alike. Both of them believe that they have knowledge of everything. It doesn't matter whether this knowledge comes from secret agents or from sacred angels. But the more of them, none of them, had the power even to come to find this invisible virus, either through science or spirit. Maybe all humanity, and not only the vulnerables, lead to a complementary relation between the two. The question is this possible? Kaisid's answer, as far as I know, is yes. Matter of fact, Kaisid did it successfully before and is prepared to do it again. After all, this is what the custodian of the two holy mosques wanted us to do from the very beginning.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Samak. That's a wonderful way for us to start, and appreciate your insights into the work of Kaisid, but also the call for a certain humility in the face of what we know and what we need to know and how we need to work with one another. I think you make a great point that even if we don't recognize we're one family, the virus certainly has. And perhaps we can learn from this experience in a way that brings us better together to struggle against some of these challenges. So I'd like to go ahead and invite Dr. Mohammed El-Sanusi, who is the Executive Director for the Network for Traditional and Religious Peacemakers, to intervene. And Dr. El-Sanusi, how can religious actors and policymakers collaborate to address and reduce some structural inequalities?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, James. It's always a pleasure to be with you here. And let me really begin to express my gratitude to the planning committee of the G20 Interfaith Forum, and particularly to Kaisid for hosting this event this year, in spite of the difficult circumstances that we're facing today. Of course, among a plethora of events, this year marked the 15th anniversary of the responsibility to protect. As we celebrate this anniversary, it is vital to apply its commitment to the current pandemic to ensure a strengthened cooperation and collaboration between policymakers and religious actors to protect vulnerable communities during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. So religious and faith-based institutions, actors, and always, can be positively contributing to preventing the spread of the virus and serve as a source of reliable information. Religious and traditional actors are frequently well-positioned to respond and communicate information and teaching to communities in times of crisis. Through this added value, governments have been actively seeking to collaborate with religious communities to better address the pandemic in local communities. For instance, in large parts of Somalia, people do not have access to correct information disseminated by government or health authorities. And in many instances, religious and traditional leaders have more authority and influence on local communities than authorities at the national level. With support of the Foreign Ministry of Finland, the network and the Finchurch Aid in Somalia, together with many other partners, we will able to disseminate information to communities so that they can get the right information that they need to protect those who are vulnerable. I'd also like to highlight how the National Muslim COVID-19 Response Committee in Kenya also work closely with government and with communities to address similar issues. For instance, the committee created the onset of the pandemic, and it's comprised of consortium with more than 30 organizations and institutions. Each one complementary to other and specialized in specific aspect of it. But the committee has taken an interreligious approach, meaning that while this committee is almost completely comprised of Muslims, they ensure to develop and implement safety measures in which can be transferable to other faith tradition and practice. For instance, the Ministry of Health in Kenya has encouraged the Christian community to utilize guidelines developed by the committee in order to help combat the spread of the virus during reopening houses of worship and conducting celebrations and ceremonies, such religious barriers. So since the onset of the pandemic, the committee has grown to be a trusted actor by the Kenyan government as it contributes key elements to curb the spread of the virus. So that's really an example that we really need to highlight. In addition, promoting government health messaging, government have reached out also, we know, to faith communities to encourage utilization of contextual theology as a means to communicate with faith communities from a moral standpoint of view on the importance of safety measures and hygiene practices to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We also know that youth played a major role on this. So collaboration with government also must expand, to include youth and women of faith as well, to as they are well positioned to function at the time of crisis as resilient community actors and innovative collaboration in addressing the pandemic. Another example comes from Southeast Asia, where youth are mobilized to collaborate with elders, religious actors, and leaders to counter false narrative, expelled by the extremist organizations, and to report fake news. One such method is through intergenerational online campaign and webinars to promote interfaith values and tolerance, while simultaneously providing accurate information related to the pandemic. So civil society and faith-based organizations are always, also integrating moral governance and peace education lessons into the current circumstances. So just to conclude, really, to say that multilateral institutions, government and local leaders are closely collaborating to address hate speech and misinformation in Southeast Asia. So these kind of few examples, I just illustrated clearly, demonstrate Sustainable Development Goal 17, which is calling really for partnership between all communities, all aspects of society, and no one should be left behind. Thank you again, and we really need to collaborate together, all segments of society, to protect those who are vulnerable. Thanks so much, James.
Mohammed, thank you. You raised some very, very critical points. I know you know of the Mennonite peacemaker John Paul Lederach, who talks about middle-out institutions and how important they are to be able to reach from policymakers to communities. And as you say, the religious institutions really are some of the greatest institutions that we have that can, if they gain the trust of the government, they oftentimes already have the trust of the communities. And in order to fight disinformation and make sure that accurate information is transmitted, they can play an absolutely critical role. So thank you so much for raising those points, Mohammed. I'd like to turn now to Her Excellency, the Ambassador Teresa Injane, who is the Director General for the International Cultural Relations of the Federal Ministry for European and International Affairs in Austria, and ask you, Ambassador, if you talk a little bit about the role of culture in the cultural sector, and particularly the arts, in supporting vulnerable groups during these times, and in particular, how the arts can help us sort of reimagine community as we're trying to understand how to behave with one another in these isolated situations that we find ourselves in. Ambassador? I believe you're still muted, Ambassador. I'm sorry, if you can take off the mute.
Yes, thank you. And good morning or evening to all of you from Vienna. Before I start, a word of gratitude and appreciation to the organizers of this huge conference and to the excellent team at CAICID here in Vienna. We are in a time of crisis, a health crisis which causes an economic. It puts public actors under pressure. And all this should be seen in the context of climate change and the so desperately needed human care for the environment. Challenges that we try to respond to. So much suffering and pain and hope. Many activities have come to a halt, have been slowed down. This means in a way that there is time to reflect for the ones who can, to look inward, to reconsider, to reshape and become aware of what really matters. It seems to me that now is also a time to rethink and to reimagine how we want to go on. It is a time to look closely at our values and see if they correspond to present needs. In his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis warns against radical individualism, against globalization of carelessness, and a society of exclusion. We hear through him the eternal call for brotherly and sisterly love, a culture of encounter, dialogue, and compassion. Some probably bitterly smile at his advice for politics. He states, the road that the most courageous men have taken is called tenderness. He invites us to be hopeful, thinking positively, despite all the suffering and pain. This crisis holds a potential for change. It forces us to do things differently. At the core of our panel is the notion of vulnerability. Since at the core of my professional life are international cultural relations and the arts in general, I would like to share with you the following. In Austria, the cultural dimension, the awareness of what the arts can contribute to the fabric of life is high. The arts are much more than something decorative or pleasant. The arts and the artists are essential for creating consciousness. Religion, philosophy, and the arts, in the paradise of an all-encompassing mind they could be one, can touch the very essence of our being, The arts help to deal with life and to shape our reality. The current pandemic has a crushing effect on the art sector and on the work of international cultural relations. Postponed or cancelled activities, cultural venues forced to close their doors, artists and organizations severely affected. They move, just like us, to the digital realm as an initial response. But how to go forward? National, regional, and local governments have taken important measures to mitigate the crisis, and the European Commission has launched the Creatives Unite platform to gather such initiatives. Friendly relations with the world depend on people meeting, so we must adapt our way of working in the digital realm, but the need for face-to-face meetings will remain, as well as physical presence for artistic performance. Culture is at the heart of progress. It can play a key role in and after this crisis. In Austria, there is a call on politics to give even more weight to culture, as artists can help express and make more clear and visible how we want to live tomorrow. Also, cooperation between artists and scientists is promising. The connection of their ideas, inspiration, and knowledge can lead to results that infuse hope. In this context, I would like to mention a successful platform in Austria called Repairing the Future, where, in a national effort, the best and most creative ideas of to master the current and future challenges are being collected with a view to putting them into practice. We want to go international with this initiative, Repairing the Future. Secondly, I briefly would like to address a different kind of vulnerability in connection with digitalization. The pandemic has increased and accelerated digitalization. While cultural life with physical presence was almost rendered impossible, online entertainment boomed even more. A lot of activities, you all know that, were transferred to the virtual space. But mind, our online behavior might differ from our behavior in the real world, and it might be, or actually is, under automated surveillance. It is increasingly directed or manipulated by artificial intelligence algorithms and a personalized, addictive offer. Moreover, we increasingly turn to social media for information. It is a new behavioral pattern that might increase distrust in democratic institutions as such, or polarize opinions. This again has effect on our behavior in society and the underlying structures of values. We need a new digital humanism, which ensures that our digitalized world and ever increasingly powerful new technology, like artificial intelligence, puts the human being and his or her dignity in the center. It is imperative to avoid that the human being gets degraded to a manipulated and exploited resource. The arts hold a central position in dealing with this new digital humanism, and all this takes us back to the one question: which image of the human do we embrace? Which relation to Mother Earth? Religions can give us guidance, and the arts enrich our lives. It is the soul that defines the human being. It guides us through time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And just to highlight some of what you raised that I think is so critical as we get pushed into a digital space, these questions of manipulation of our ideas and the algorithms that determine what we see and who we hear from, I think are a real risk for polarizing and reducing people's identities and their concepts of self in this community in a way that really can increase divides. And this question of a digital humanism is one that I think is remarkably important to avoid that our humanity is getting reduced to just this digital resource space, as you say. I think that's really critical, and I hope to ask you some questions about that here towards the end to deepen our understanding of that. But thank you so very much for raising these questions about culture and arts and how they can play a role in connecting us to our humanity, even as we're separated from one another. So I'd like to turn now to Ms. Sarah Rahim, who is the International Program Manager at A Common Word Among the Youth, ACWAY. She's also been a UN Youth Representative for the Parliament of the World's Religions. And Ms. Rahim, can you tell us how young people in particular have been impacted by COVID-19 and how there are opportunities for support and collaboration through the youth sector in our communities?
Definitely. Thank you, James, for that introduction. I hope you can see me and hear me all right. Hello, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and friends. I'm honored to join you at this year's virtual G20 Forum. Young person working to promote global interfaith action, I'm humbled to be participating in a conversation with policy, faith, and civil society leaders from around the world. I'm also pleased to be speaking on behalf of my global youth organization, ACWAY, also known as A Common Word Among the Youth. ACWAY is a youth-led global interfaith movement engaging young people from over 85 countries to take action in their local communities. So I hope to spend a few minutes sharing more about how people have been impacted by COVID-19 and opportunities for us to support and collaborate that population. Since the adoption of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, our global community has committed to engage young people to achieve inclusive, sustainable, and stable societies, combat the threats of climate change, economic instability, poverty, gender inequity, conflict, and migration. And today, our global community contains over 1.2 billion young people aged 15 to 24, who make up 16% of the global population. However, challenges still remain when it comes to access to education, with upper secondary enrollment rates averaging only 14% in low-income countries. Undoubtedly, the COVID-19 pandemic has widened these gaps even more, unmasking additional forms of exclusion that especially marginalize children, women, and youth with disabilities. According to the Global Initiative on Decent Youth, over 73% of those surveyed experienced school closures, and all of them were not able to transition into online and distance learning. COVID-19 has also left 1 in 8 young people without access to courses, teaching, or training, a situation that highlights the digital divide that exists between regions. Access to stable employment for young people is also challenging. The pandemic has destroyed employment opportunities on young workers, with 1 in 6 young people who were employed before the outbreak now stopping work altogether. 2 out of 5 young people reported a reduction in their income, and young people in lower income countries are the most exposed to reduction in working hours. Young people have also reported an indirect impact on their freedom of movement. 1 in 3 noticed an impact on their right to participate in public affairs. And over a quarter of young people experienced difficulties in exercising their right to freedom of religion or belief. Ignorance about the religious other has also been increased due to this climate of fear and intolerance and, frankly, disconnect. So Despite these challenges that the pandemic has deepened, young people remain committed to stepping up and partnering safely and effectively with civil society, with social partners, and government institutions. Over 1 in 4 young people reported actively engaging in volunteerism and in making donations towards COVID-19 response efforts. Young people went on to call to governments to continue enforcing containment, such as working from home when possible. To this degree, my first recommendation to G20 leaders is the incorporation of the Interfaith Development Goals, which were drafted and created by ACWE. The Interfaith Development Goals are intended to complement the SDGs, where we, the young people of ACWE, saw a gap. They were developed to capture and demonstrate how religious, faith, and spiritual leaders can contribute to building peace and harmony around the world. And these IDGs were developed over 2.5 years by young people with support from senior leaders. So I'll take a minute just to highlight 2 IDGs. The first is IDG Goal 4, intergenerational engagement. We must encourage and promote young people to take an active role in their faith communities and civil society in order to foster cross-cultural understanding in a sustainable way. I would also like to highlight IDG Goal 6, which is access to interfaith education and religious literacy. Both at a national and international level, we must continue to encourage dialogue and inclusive education across faiths and culture, especially during a time in which fear and misunderstanding is rampant. In order to have successful dialogue, we must create virtual educational and interfaith pathways that promote exposure to and knowledge of the religious other. Staying connected in a time of disconnect and uncertainty is crucial. So to conclude, practitioners, governments, and the global community have decades to tackle the challenges that youth and children face around the world. It is very common for policy and faith leaders to make recommendations that address these issues based on their knowledge and expertise. But I'd like to ask you all today, how effective can implementations actually be without having young people as part of the decision-making process? So the greatest recommendations that I can offer, especially in the context of COVID-19, is to further develop policies that protect, integrate, and develop young people. This includes urgent and targeted investment in decent jobs for youth, employment and job training programs, social protection, greater efforts to boost the quality and delivery of online training and distance learning, looking at stronger mental health resources, and finally, investing in programs and partnerships that combat the threats of climate change. So as young people, we challenge G20 leaders to focus attention to children and youth rights and protections, translating policies into practice. Youth participation in local faith communities and civil society movements can yield more sustainable and intergenerational support. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for these for the insightful overviews, but also for the practical recommendations, actual steps that we can encourage our colleagues to take to address some of the issues that you raise. I find it very interesting that while simultaneously there's been a significant impact with respect to the pandemic in terms of education, in terms of access to work, you also mentioned that volunteerism is on the rise in the youth sector. And so there are ways in which I think you are showing us that people are finding, particularly youth, are finding the ability to still engage and still share their voice. So I look forward to asking you some more questions about these issues of freedom of worship, freedom of movement that you touched on, and how that has affected the youth and their ability to participate and give guidance. Oftentimes we hear people of our older generation saying that we have to engage the youth in order to teach them, but I think we need to change that attitude and engage the youth in order to hear from them and get guidance from them. So thanks for your intervention. We will definitely come back and plumb a little more the depths of some of the ideas that you've raised. I'd like to turn now to Professor Maris Tadros, who is the director of the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development, and a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. And Professor Tadros, if you will talk to us a little bit about religious marginalization and how different vulnerabilities in this space are intersecting during the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this incredibly perfectly organized conference, and for creating an opportunity for us to discuss and learn together. We know that COVID-19 is religion blind. You don't have to belong to a faith or be of no faith. In both cases, you can be affected by COVID. There is no one immune. No person of faith or no faith can claim immunity from COVID-19 on account of they believe or don't believe in. But we also know that, unfortunately, the responses to COVID-19 have not been religion blind. Where we have cases of intersecting vulnerabilities, in other words, people who happen to be members of religiously marginalized groups, but who also happen to be poor, who also happen to live in who come from economically excluded backgrounds, who also happen to be in geographically displaced areas, those kind of intersections have actually created a very, very sobering situation. Now, the intention here is not to create a hierarchy of suffering. We know that women have suffered a great deal, especially when they have become victims of domestic violence in cases of enclosures. We know that poor people living in squatter settlements have suffered incredibly with the loss of informal livelihoods in a context where they don't have anything to fall on. We know that there has been mass suffering across. Even the middle class have also suffered, and as a consequence, the social capital that they offer in supporting others has been ruptured. In faith-based organizations, for example, rely on the economic resources coming from the middle class. So the intention to talk about the intersecting vulnerabilities affecting religious minorities and religiously marginalized groups is not to create a hierarchy of suffering. But it is to say that the situation is very serious because of its implications, not just for these groups, but for society at large. But the first thing is what you've all referred to is the issue of hate speech. And what we have seen, for example, in Pakistan, and we have documented this in our program, is that there was a great deal of hate speech towards the Hazara Shias, blaming them for being on pilgrimages in Iran, coming back. They called it the Shia virus. This is what was spread. And this is not just rhetoric. This had immediate spillover effect into the communities. For example, members of the Shia community who were working in hospitals, were working in education, were working in security, were told, don't come to work. We don't want you coming to work. Of course, what we have seen in places where people were put in quarantine, and we know this is not just religious minorities, we've seen this as a global phenomenon where people were put in inhumane conditions in quarantine. This was almost reached a point of turning into violence because people obviously have only so much they can bear. Worse, I think, and equally bad is that hate speech isn't any longer a national phenomenon. What is the worst thing about hate speech is because it's based on rumors and stereotypified ideas, is once it starts in one area, it quickly circulates to become a global phenomenon. And so what we see is that because it is locally affected but global, we need a global reaction to this. And for us as a program, when we, for example, noticed that one particular official, and this is a government official, who started propagating hate speech against the Ahmadiyyas at the time of COVID, we immediately asked Facebook, please bring down these statements. Please stop the circulation of this. And we were successful, but only after immense pressure. And I think this is where the role of global civil society, the role of religious leaders, independently of what faith they have or no faith, is to actually take action immediately against hate speech. Because we know that there is power in the collective. And that just, I think, when we talk about interdependence, as our esteemed guests have talked about, this is where independence is put to the test. Are we willing to speak up to people whose faith is not our own? Are we willing to say, bring this down, this is not acceptable? This is the first point. But I think the second point is that we know that hate speech also spillovers across the border. So whenever there is hate speech, for example, against the Hindus in Pakistan or against the Muslims in India, this has a ripple effect. And that kind of ripple effect is very, very dangerous, because we saw, for example, also in India, that the hate speech against Muslims got to the point where violence was occurring. And I think what we pay attention to is when we're talking about the religiously marginalized poor, it affects their livelihoods. It means that because of the spread of these rumors, people don't want to buy from them. People don't want to touch them. People don't want to let them into schools. They're seen as the source of the virus. In India, we saw reference to this being the jihadi virus. So this is when it really does affect the very survival of members of religious minorities on a day-to-day basis. Now, the other thing which is very important to talk about religious minorities, again, this is not specific to one country, but this is a global pattern we have documented. And please look at the document we've made available to all, and if you can't find it, email me, is we have documented across the way in which when you belong to certain religious minorities and you happen to come from despised caste or a despised class across the world, you happen to be seen as dirty, as lacking in cleanliness. And what we have seen in many contexts is that people who belong to religious minorities have been laid off, especially if they work as domestic servants or they work in as hairdressers and so forth, in service sector. And that has had an implication on the entire family. So again, challenging these conceptions that any particular religious group is a source of pollution or an uncleanliness is something that is extremely important, and that cuts across religious affiliation as well as class and caste. But also, I think what the COVID-19 in terms of its response has shown, and Ms. Patton has pointed out, it didn't create these dynamics. It only amplified their pre-existence. Is the fact that the very small religious minorities, the smaller you are numerically and the more geographically isolated you are, the less likely you are to be able to have access to information about how to protect yourself, to resources, to even be invited to represent your faith. For example, in Uganda, while the Ugandan government took immediate steps to invite faith leaders to the negotiating table to talk about how to increase outreach and resources and so forth, the very small religious groups, especially those that belong to indigenous religions, were not invited. So this is a time for us to really think about our ideas of inclusion and exclusion. And I think also for the international community, because we have been very uncomfortable about talking about religious desegregated data. We have seen it as divisive, we have seen it as problematic, and in many ways it is, let's not deny it. But I think this is a point where we really have to be careful, because if we are dispersing assistance programs and we're not asking the hard questions, such as not only whether it's reaching marginalized women, but also whether it's reaching religiously marginalized groups, and the devil is in the details in this, we will perpetuate and accentuate situations of inequality and increased inequality. A really important point is consistency. This is where many of you refer to trust. Trust between religious leaders and governments, trust between the arts and policymakers and the people, and trust is important. But one of the key things that helps foster and nurture trust is our consistency. If we put one rule for one group, we must apply it across the border so that people feel that they're not being targeted, or a word that I don't want to use in a negative way, but scapegoated. So I think these are issues that have not been created by COVID-19, but certainly our responses to COVID-19 have brought to the fore. And now is the time to look at how do we then build better in a way that is interdependent, but also recognizes our global responsibility in these three things. 3 points quickly is hate speech, our collective responsibility to assist, aid, and how inclusive it is. And thirdly, the question of ripple effect beyond the borders and our common collective responsibility to fix them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Tadros. This question of existing vulnerabilities and marginalization being reinforced now by the fears and concerns or whatever crisis arises, I think is unfortunately a common experience for us. We see existing prejudices that in many cases we've worked hard in some contexts to undo and to unpack, just being reinforced and justified through some of these new accusations towards these marginalized groups as being those who are bringing around whatever crisis it is that we're dealing with. We hear a lot about this with respect to migrant groups, of course, as well, who are already, they tend to be marginalized groups in the communities they're moving into. And I've seen in plenty of places around the world how they are being scapegoated, as you say, for bringing this illness or other kinds of challenges and problems to communities. And so that raises a really difficult question for us, is how do we continue to work to unpack these prejudices, but particularly where there are new justifications for them based on fear and experience. I also very much like that you've raised the regional spillover question. This is something that I know at ICRD we're actually trying to look closely at. Oftentimes we get kind of caught in a single community or a single program in a single country and forget that there is community affinity from country to country, and oftentimes what happens in one country has a backlash effect in other places. So there's a lot there for us to look at. I appreciate your so allow me now to turn to my friend Maria Lucia Uribe, who is the director of Arigato International in Geneva. It's nice to see you again, Maria Lucia. And can you talk to us a little bit about actually kind of unpacking some of the ideas that we just heard, this question of going from existing vulnerabilities to a kind of resilience and empowerment of these communities, certainly in a time when the pandemic just adds to other kinds of existing challenges and vulnerabilities.
Thank you, James. It's a pleasure for me to be joining this panel, and I thank also Kari and the organizers for bringing us together online in these challenging times. So I want to start by saying that thinking of people as vulnerable can be tricky, as it makes us focus on a deficit approach that conceives individuals and groups as powerless. It also labels them as defined category in which several groups of people are put in without consideration of the individual factors and the differentiators. And therefore, this is the first premise to rethink the perception of vulnerable people. Vulnerability is not static, nor it is absolute, and people are not categories within a vulnerability framework. Vulnerability are the social, political, economic conditions of the population in a given time that might impact their capacity to cope with the challenges they go through. And this means the discourse about vulnerable communities, we should first focus on those social, economic, political conditions that can strengthen the response and capacities. So I want to center my intervention on a particular group of the population that has been highly affected indirectly and directly by the COVID-19 pandemic, which are children. And this is, of course, the focus of Arigato International in the work we do. From the beginning of the pandemic, children were made invisible. We were told that children were not highly affected by the virus, and therefore they were not addressed in the response to the pandemic. Later, they were categorized as passive vectors of transmission, and all schools and learning places were shut down, leaving 1.6 million children out of school in 188 countries around the world. This is an unprecedented fact, with long-term impacts on children's well-being and in their future, impacts that are still being invisible in policy responses to the crisis and in the approach approaches to address the consequences of the pandemic. Children are not just victims of the pandemic, but they are one of the most affected, as the COVID-19 has profound effect on their physical, social-emotional, and also spiritual well-being. So I want to propose 3 different lenses to rethink the perception of children as vulnerable people during the crisis, and that can probably help us change not only the discourse, but also the actions and responses to them. The first is addressing the pandemic as endemic, and Professor Tadros was talking about this earlier. Response to the impact of COVID-19 has been looking at the disease in itself and alone, without a systemic understanding about the conditions in which the virus develops or can create higher shocks and impacts on the population. The deadly impact of the pandemic is not caused by the virus acting alone, but interacting with chronic diseases against the background of inequalities, as it was pointed out before. We know that globally the pandemic is expected to lead to unprecedented increases in poverty. And the latest reports by UNICEF and Save the Children estimate that the ongoing crisis can increase the number of children living in poverty by up to 170 million children by the end of this year. And it also warns us that additional 1.2 million children and around 57,000 mothers could die in the next 6 months due to the disruption in basic interventions. And we know that with the closing of schools, millions of children around the world have no access to the only meal that they receive during the day. And we also know that COVID-19 is projected to hit particularly hard food, nutrition, health security of young children, pregnant and lactating women, further exacerbating social and health inequities. So the evidence shows that multidimensional effects of the household food insecurity will affect caregivers' mental health, affecting child development outcomes, increasing intimate partner violence, infectious diseases in children, and non-communicable diseases, which are, of course, risk factors for teen patients. But also the evidence shows that people from ethnic or religious communities and minority groups are disproportionately affected by COVID-19, as they're also further discriminated against. So we see how the virus feeds on already existing risk factors and structural issues that existed and that are now exacerbated by the pandemic. So addressing the multiple stressors and the pathways to vulnerability can help challenging the perception of particular groups of the population as vectors of transmissions or the response to a single cause, and focus the attention to address those underlying causes of exclusion, inequities, social disparities that, of course, lead to negative higher impacts on the population. The second point is moving from vulnerability to resilience and empowerment, which is what you were saying, James, and also Sarah alluded to this when talking about young people. Shifting the focus from vulnerability to building resilience in the systems, but also on people, can help children and young people to see themselves as part of the solution and not of the problem. Building resilience can be done by helping children to connect to one another, to strengthen those connections that in a way they lost because they were forced to be physically distant from one another. Creating spaces for them to participate and raise their voices, especially during this time when the civic space has been shrunk. And also creating spaces to foster ethical reflections about the future they want to see and create spaces for them to rebuild trust in one another, in the community, and hope in the future, which I think the pandemic has challenged us to believe and to see. This is part, of course, of focusing on the spiritual well-being of children, which is often not considered in the social programs, responses, and education. However, studies show that spirituality contributes to strengthen people's resilience and can be considered as a critical aspect in the response to the negative impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, particularly on mental health of children. So the COVID-19 pandemic has also shown the critical importance of citizens' empowerment, and this is even more important for children and young people. The unprecedented closures of schools and the transition to online learning and hybrid ways of learning has also made children more vulnerable to online risk, cyberbullying, including, and among others, also the exposure to online hate speech. So children's capacity to navigate these complex virtual realities, competing at times divisive narratives and interactions, is very critical for their sound development. Strengthening quality inclusive education to address the social, emotional, and spiritual needs of children can strengthen their agency and empower them to develop empathy and solidarity with one another. In a way, and in a world that is adult-centered, children's empowerment and expanded opportunities for participation are paramount to develop more inclusive and peaceful societies. So the last point is focusing on interdependence. And Your Excellency, you talk about this interdependence and interconnectedness. So never before we have seen how interconnected and interdependent our societies and people are, and it is to break silos between the development, humanitarian, and peace-building fields to transcend the divides and to address the short-term but also long-term impacts of COVID-19. Our religious teachings hold true the very meaning and importance of our interconnectedness and seeking the divine in each and every one. We know that epidemics create fear, and fear is a key ingredient for racism and xenophobia to succeed. To change the discourse about vulnerable communities, we need to create more spaces for people of diverse cultural, religious, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds to come together, dialogue, and collaborate. We also need to develop community-based approaches where beneficiaries of interventions, particularly children and people, take leadership, support each other, and are key partners in developing strategies that relate to their own assistance and protection, helping to challenge their view as vulnerable and powerless to transform the perception of them and their involvement. So religious communities are central to these community-based approaches as their work focuses on affirming the dignity of each and every one, and you mentioned this before, James, and bringing those at the margins to the center. Interfaith collaboration and action are now more critical than ever to shape this new normal, and it is needed to mobilize a collective leadership and develop, I would say, a moral imagination that can help us transform our societies together to support the well-being of children and young people around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Lucia. This is really critical. I think you raise a number of very important points, but two in particular that I'd like to highlight. What's the idea of vulnerability itself being a very tricky concept? It's not bounded. It's not consistent. Rather, it's bounded by context. You know, this is all about the dynamics of our social systems and our relational systems, institutional systems. So in some contexts, one group might be vulnerable, but in another context, they may be empowered. And those who are seen as being empowered or protected or having access to resources and assets might in other contexts be facing certain vulnerabilities. And so to not get trapped in this mindset that there are certain vulnerable groups and those need to be dealt with in certain ways. And then, of course, the interrelated point that you raise about taking a deficit approach. I find that oftentimes in our conflict-related work that my institution is in, we fall into the trap on occasion of looking at things with a deficit analysis. You know, what is broken, rather than looking at things with an asset analysis and seeing, you know, where are people empowered to have agency. And I think this is a very critical point that we also heard when we talked about youth, in terms of, you know, youth being pushed to the margins more and excluded more, having certain impact time, having certain key kinds of agency that we need to be able to emphasize and bring to the fore. So thank you for those two very, very important points. One other thing that you touched on briefly, and I think that, you know, being a father of a 10 and 6-year-old who are in the next room online in classes right now, I've witnessed very closely the tug of war over whether or not kids should be in school. And it's become very politicized, at least in our country, in this context, in the United States, and I'm sure that's probably true elsewhere. And so rather than talking about the needs of children around their social and environmental and emotional and mental health needs, a lot of this has now become a political game, and we've lost the focus that we need to have on on what is the right way to deal with some of these challenges that we have in front of us. So thanks for raising all of that. And I'll turn now to our last panelist, by no means least panelist, again, a good friend, Reverend Victor Kazanjian, who is the Executive Director of the United Religions Initiative, which does exceptional work with grassroots faith leaders all around the world. And so, Victor, maybe you can give us an insight into what are some of the local grassroots faith leaders doing right now, or what can they increasingly do to help lives that we've heard about and really provide some solutions and a way forward in solving some of the problems that we've raised today.
Thanks so much, James. It's good to be with you, and thanks to the G20 Forum and to Kaisid for making this happen. And I want to return to James's powerful opening that, you know, COVID has revealed these pervasive injustices that continue to exist in our world, and also that it's presented us with opportunity. And each of my colleagues on this panel has spoken so beautifully about that. Dr. Samek's call that we human beings are one. Mohammed's illustrating the importance of collaboration among all sectors. Ambassador Engine's quoting Pope Francis and the culture of dialogue and compassion and the call for tenderness. And Sarah's constant voice promoting the wisdom of young leaders and calling us to be an inclusive movement. And Professor Tadros' intersecting vulnerabilities and the suffering of those who are marginalized, and hate speech, which we see so frequently now. And then Maria Lucia is calling us to the impact of children and building resilience. I'm so grateful to each of you for your wisdom and insights. And as James spoke about at the beginning, and I think we see, there are long shadows that are settling over our beloved planet, and they continue dislocation and devastation caused by conflict and wars and economic, gender, and social injustice, and questions about democracy itself, and then the sort of cries of the earth as our environment becomes more toxic. But then there's this grief and sickness and death and disruption being caused by the coronavirus pandemic, and it's put a spotlight on our systems and structures and what works and what doesn't work in the lives of human beings. I think too often in the way the COVID pandemic is being engaged, ordinary people appear like buried in a mountain of statistics. And as such, they become dehumanized. So I think what's important for us, what I have the privilege of experiencing each day, is to call to mind the faces, the particular individual people, the women, indigenous persons, children, those who are economically poor, those who are marginalized, calling to mind their faces. And we could do that right now, right? We could call to mind in our minds a person who we know who is particularly vulnerable at this moment, and what they are experiencing and feeling, and to rehumanize this moment, this dehumanizing moment, when so many people feel isolated and alone, so many people are struggling with disruption of their lives and the devastation of this illness. And so I think for those of us that work with people and are made up of people, these organizations whose beliefs and behaviors emerge from spiritual principles, part of our work is to rehumanize, to constantly rehumanize this dehumanizing situation, not only the pandemic, but all of the ancillary things that are injustices in our world. And to bring to life the experience of people living in villages and living in cities and urban areas. I think what I experience certainly is that the wisdom that emerges from grassroots communities is the wisdom that we need to hear and often don't hear and often don't incorporate. And the creativity that's happening on the ground in caring for the everyday lives of people, the ways in which people are delivering food, are educating around health, are watching out for those who slip into places of crisis. Those ways in which communities form a network, a sort of micro network in which care is being given, in part through the systems that are there as well, but in part through the informal structures and informal leadership that's emerging from the grassroots. And I think that's an important learning, is that while the formal structures are crucial, and in delivering services, in doing analysis, in creating good policy, and we often focus on formal leaders as what we define leaders. Actually, it's the informal sectors, the informal systems that are operating powerfully, that kick in moments like this when there's paralysis in other parts of our society. So I think how we support those informal systems, how we are able to get out of just the sort of structural work that we do and look at the ways in which we can resource people on the ground in their communities at a very local level is one of the things that we're challenged to do, and one of the things that many folks here in this panel and many other organizations are doing. And I think the folks in the interfaith sector are particularly oriented towards this. That allows us then to put in motion something on the ground that deals with these larger issues: commodification of health, economic disparity, the technology gap, gender violence has been spoken about, and come back to that core piece that James opened with, which is this notion that COVID is teaching us something about connection, about interdependence, about interbeing, about separation of the perceived separation in our lives as being illusion. And I think for people in the faith community, it's particularly important because we have to also look at the ways in which religion and belief and cultural identity have been cultivated as separating forces in our lives. They're also forces of justice, also forces in peace. But if we don't look at this moment also as a time when the very institutions that we often represent, coming out of religious institutions, are themselves needing to look at the ways in which their own tendency to isolate, to claim truth, to not open to the essential spiritual force that connects us all, but to try to perpetuate their own institutional agendas is a problem. And that gets revealed as well. So in addition to all the other ways in which we're revealing the sort of brokenness of places in our society, this is a time for us to take stock as well in our own communities. And as Dr. Summit at the very beginning, to challenge those notions and to open to each other, to open our hearts, to open our minds, to become deeply connected in ways. So thank you. It's been lovely to be part of this. Many people here I work with quite often, and it's great to be with you.
Victor, thank you so much. As with everyone here, you've pointed at some incredibly profound and important aspects of the role of faith and religion in our lives, both as a force for elevating the sacred of the human in general and rehumanizing one another, but also something that, as you've just said, has unfortunately in many cases been cultivated, as you stated, as a separating force in our lives. And so it's a very interesting challenge right now to work with religion, religious faith, religious individuals, because there seems to be quite a tension within religion itself and all faith traditions between those who feel compelled to care for the entire human community and even beyond the human community, our environment and the life that it sustains, and those who feel compelled to defend and turn inward and be exclusive about their truth and what that to do to those who are different. So this is, I think, a perennial challenge for faith, and one that we really should try to use our next, maybe, I guess we have 40 minutes to unpack some of these profound points that have been raised. So let me start by turning back to Ambassador Injan and asking if you could unpack us a little bit this this point that you raised about how art and science and religion can actually act in concert to imagine a different future and a different culture and how we interact in our society, and particularly because in many cases, whether you agree or not, and I happen to, among other things, also have a degree in biology, so I have a science background as well as a theology background. But in many cases, you see that people pit science and religion against one another, and I find that is not something that I see as accurate. But the scientific community and the faith communities are at best suspicious of one another and sometimes actively hostile towards one another. And so can you unpack for us a little bit how maybe science, religion, and perhaps art and culture playing an intermediary role can help us together move forward in our conceptions of what society and culture can be?
Yeah, thank you. This is, of course, a very big question. Sometimes I wonder whether the people who deal with quantum physics will find out that the mystics were right. But so it's a big question. Well, let's maybe start with the arts. If we feel what helps us to get through life is the notion that something around us takes care of us, or that even despite the most horrible, situations, that there is something that will help us. Maybe, sorry if these words are much, maybe not very well chosen, but maybe this is a religion of belief, a longing for the other or for something that is completely intact despite our suffering here in this world. And religion can provide for that, but I think the arts can have this function too. I believe sometimes that if you like music or the music of Bach, your life is different after you have heard the St. Matthew Passion than before. And it's a place maybe in our heart. If the ultimate goal of our life is to fall into a complete love, the arts help us with that. And that's why we think, and this is one part of Austria that I love to defend, that this is essential to life. It helps for introspection and to feel that there's something bigger than maybe an actual state of mind. I had a friend, he passed away already, he was a Holocaust survivor, and he said it helped him in the most horrible situation in Auschwitz just to imagine the music, to get the feeling of hunger a little less for a few seconds. So I'm not making light of suffering, but I think the arts can be like a sun for us, like religion in their purest sense. And for science as well, it humbles us to show, that the road that science takes, there's always a new discovery. Like we can discover in our inner life, that there is always something new to see and to imagine and to discover, and that this creation is apparently endless, and we are part of it, and realizing that maybe then not, as a consolation, it's soothing. Well, yeah, I stop here, I think. I stop here. Well, there's so much to say, but I don't want to take too much time. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. There's such a great reminder in the arts that that we need to be humble in the face of maybe some of these mystical realities you refer to. The Muslim poet Hafiz has a poem that I always remember that states, first the fish has to think something ain't quite right about this camel ride, which I've always found is such a profound reminder that, we believe we know sometimes where we are and what we're experiencing, and the religious as well as the artistic and cultural can profoundly remind us just how wide the boundaries of our lack of knowledge are. And if we can embrace that humility, maybe we can embrace our differences across culture and space in a different way. I see you raising your hand again, Ambassador.
Yeah, can just make one last comment to give you. There's one example from our work here in international cultural relations in Austria. To find the convergence between science and the arts is a lot. As we work a lot with sustainability. If you look at sustainable architecture, not the beauty of architecture, but sustainably built, so that the artists get inspired by scientific needs, and that we go for cooperation in both fields. That artists inspire scientists and scientists inspire artists, for example, in the field of ecological building a new, more sustainable life. And this concerns all areas of life almost. That's one example. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think arts, faith, and science all share the qualities of wonder in the face of uncertainty and doubt. And if we ground ourselves in that, it's a very unifying experience that runs through all of them. I'd like to turn to Dr. Samak. Dr. Samak, I think Lebanon is an interesting case. It's a very unique experiment in how religious diversity kind of crosses over with politics and policy making. I know that Lebanon has unfortunately had quite a multitude of challenges in the last year, not just with COVID, obviously, or some of the recent tragedies like the explosion in the port, but also political unrest and civil protests and against corruption. So there's quite a lot going on in Lebanon that presents a lot of challenges. I also know there's a very robust interfaith effort that's happening there. Can you talk to us a little bit about how that interfaith engagement and that history of kind of religious cooperation might provide some path forward around some of these other complex challenges of politics and identity and health crises, etc.?
Well, thank you for the question, but I hope the remaining units will allow me to finish my answering this question. I'm almost at the end of my mobile here. Well, in Lebanon, as you said, Dr. James, it's a unique country in the Middle East. We have 18 religious communities, and we are living together as communities of different religions and different ethnicities also. The way we faced this pandemic really was in a very cooperative, and this pandemic came at a very critical time, politically and economically and socially in Lebanon. religious leaders work together. It is the only place in the Middle East where religious leaders work together in order to form social committees to assist and help those who are in need during this pandemic. And they work even together to close churches and mosques on Sunday and Friday in order to avoid the horrible pandemic. And they took their decisions collectively. And out of it, I'm sorry. Sorry.
You're fine, sir. We still hear you.
It's out now. I don't know. Can you see me?
Yes, sir. We're having a hard time hearing you now.
Hello?
You started to break up a little bit. So can you hear us all right? I think perhaps we may have lost our good connection with Dr. Samak. So if he returns, I'll invite him to continue to share his comments on that space. But in the meantime, I'd like to go back to Sarah Rahim and ask you, Sarah, you raised a lot of, I think, very provocative and interesting points and statistics about participation of youth. One of the things that struck me is you spoke about restrictions on freedom of movement and worship. And then, of course, you gave some recommendations on incorporating some intermittent goals that complement the SDGs around participation, civil participation, and religious literacy and things like that. So can you connect those ideas for us a little bit and tell us what are some of the specifics and statistics or ways, even anecdotal ways that freedom of movement and worship have struck at the youth around the world based on COVID, and then how the Interfaith Development Goals maybe hope to unpack and help to reverse some of those problems.
Sure, James. All great questions. I think the first thing is that we can all really agree that these are unprecedented times. You know, COVID-19 is really challenging how we think about how we define religious freedom or the lack thereof. And how do you strike this balance, right, between protecting public health during this pandemic, but also respecting civil liberties, as you mentioned. So that also includes the freedom to exercise your religious beliefs, right, or the freedom to convene. What is this balance of religious leaders having authority to make decisions about what's safe for folks to convene and what's not? So there's this tension there. What I can say about, at least anecdotally, about the young people I'm hearing around the world is, you know, there's definitely we're in a space of transition. Folks who historically of community in person don't have access to that anymore, right? Be it a faith community or at least youth components of their houses of worship, they're no longer accessible. So two thoughts come to mind. The first is how are we defining community for young people, right? Both in spiritual and secular ways. And are we creating access to those communities in a virtual format? So, you know, I have the privilege of living in the United States and I attend mosque about 10 minutes away. And it was quite easy for our house of worship to pivot into a digital virtual space, right? So we were able to live stream our services so I could access that from the freedom and safety of my home. Now, obviously, you know, there's a large digital divide and disparities exist across the world. So that's not the case for all. So I think another question that I have, and maybe not the answer, is how are we addressing the idea of digital equity, right, when it comes to accessing your faith community? So what I can say is I know young people are creative in adapting in different ways. And those who have access to Wi-Fi, they're creating WhatsApp groups and Zoom meetings, to convene from their church or synagogue or mosque, and trying to find digital ways to maintain that sense of community and continue building that. So I think there just needs to be a larger streamlined effort across, religious leaders to really zoom into what that looks like. And unfortunately, when it's not safe to convene, how can we support young people in their right to practice, right? And those who don't have that freedom or right to practice in the safety of their homes. So I think we should also just think about what the safety and protection of these vulnerable communities look like now that our, freedom of access and moving is limited there.
Great, thank you so much. And yeah, I think you're absolutely right. The existing digital divide globally is going to have an exponentially reflected impact on people's ability to worship. I'm also based in the United States, and witnessed a lot of communities who sort of seamlessly moved on to the online space. But then many other communities I've worked with abroad that just don't have access, whether it's reliable internet or any internet or computers or even reliable electricity, have lost all that contact with their faith communities. And obviously faith practice is such a community-oriented thing generally that it's had a real effect on folks. Let me ask Professor Tadros to talk a little bit about this question of hate speech. You mentioned that Shia pilgrims coming back from Iran were treated very poorly, and even the virus was even labeled a Shia virus. Of course, in other places, including here at home, we've heard things like, the China virus or unfortunately the Kung flu, things that folks think are creative and humorous, but really are incredibly dull in terms of how it reinforces a narrative of othering and discrimination. Oftentimes, in my experience, I've seen that this really is just a way to justify either social exclusions that people are already committed to, or even policies to further exclude different groups. How can we disentangle this, or even learn from how the work that's been done in the past on breaking down prejudices and stereotypes, things like sectarian divides in Pakistan, for example, work that ICRD has done in the past, and apply some of that experience and the headway we've made there to resisting this backsliding into the scapegoating of different groups because of the virus?
It's very complicated because we know this goes back historically. We know that in the Middle Ages, the Jews were seen to be responsible for the plague, and we know that there were pogroms happening in many countries. This was significant communities being wiped out because people mobilize on the basis that if you eliminate these communities, then you have a better chance of eliminating the virus. And I think the challenge is that in many cases, we do see very clear points of mobilization by political leaders and religious leaders. I think we need to be able to look at where people are seeking to establish their legitimacy and the basis of their power through dehumanizing and ostracizing others in a context where there are pre-existing prejudices. And I think we need to be very blunt here and talk about accountability, is that we need to see governments take action against local officials, very stern actions. Should they tweet? Should they engage in Instagram or any other mechanism where they are making deeply hateful statements about religious minorities? Because what we do know from global politics is that there is an appetite for this, unfortunately. As I think all the panelists have agreed, this is not a new phenomenon. This is pre-existing, deeply held up and down. They've always got an ebb and flow. And how do we bring it down again? And I think accountability is very important. People need to know that they will lose their jobs, they'll be suspended if they engage in hateful speech against any particular group, not just religious minorities, ethnic, any kind of group that is maligned and stigmatized. I think the second thing is the speed with which we respond, because what we know is the tipping point between the circulation of rumors and that tipping point that then becomes violent is very, very quickly. We need to be able to be very agile at responding very quickly. And I think this is where the role of faith leaders, traditional leaders, and anyone with power, the ability to act very quickly to say, these are rumors, this has to go down, we can't buy into this, because things circulate very, very quickly. And I think the other point is that we need to be able to understand and take this seriously, because what we do know is that people come up with kinds of excuses. Oh, but maybe they are partly to blame. Oh, but the excuses. Oh, but it's not that bad. Oh, but give it time. Oh, but everybody's suffering. I think we need to come to terms with what are the excuses, the justifications that may not be said publicly because they're not particularly correct, but are underneath the surface that make people not be willing to take it seriously and to see it not just as a threat for the community that is being stigmatized, but for society as a whole. We're talking here about social cohesion. We're talking here about spillover effects of violence in which everybody will be affected. To see it as a case where it isn't just about protecting a community, but protecting who we are. And I think that is where stopping hate speech needs to be able to be more powerful, is making it something that is not just about a group defending itself or one group, but about our collective responsibility to take action. Just to say on effectiveness, I think for our group, so the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development is convened by the Institute of Development Studies, where I'm a professor of politics and development, consortium. And in that consortium, we have minority rights group, we have Al-Khoi, which is a Muslim organization, we have Refsemi, which is a Coptic Orthodox Christian organization, as well as a multitude of local partners. And I think where we felt we responded very quickly and very effectively is our local partners in Pakistan. And by the way, they were not from the Ahmadiyya community. This was another religious said, we are very concerned about what is being said about the Ahmadiyyas in Pakistan and about an official saying they should be beheaded. And we immediately, our partners in the consortium minority rights group, wrote to Facebook, said, we are watching you. How quickly you remove this hate speech. And I think the more we create these solidarities, the more we're able to respond quickly, because then they actually removed it. They didn't remove it as quickly as we wanted, but I hope it means that next time they know that we're keeping an eye on this, because they eventually did remove it. It took about 48 hours, not quick enough, but it was removed.
Yes. All right. Thank you. Yeah. This principle of religious freedom, tolerance, and protection is one that I find has some interesting challenges, particularly as it gets politicized. But hopefully we can continue to embrace the idea that.
Very, very quickly. That's why we call ourselves the Coalition for Religious Equality and Inclusive Development. We don't call ourselves the Coalition for Freedom of Religion or Belief, because we know the term belief has to be politicized. And from my perspective, 20 years of development practice, I think the best way to bring in principles of inclusivity is to make it interconnected. Talk about religious inclusivity in relation to poverty, in relation to gender, in relation to youth, our program is youth-led on the ground, and also at the governing level, and to talk about those intersections, because we don't want to use language that has already been politicized. And for us, it's about equality, because there's an equality of who we are that is fundamentally important. That's why we talk about religious equality, not freedom of religion or belief, on purpose. Sorry to have interrupted.
No, that's great. I mean, it goes back to this idea of interdependence as well, right? Emphasizing that protecting my right requires that I protect the rights of all to the same same freedoms and the same protections. And I think that gets lost sometimes when folks are so focused on their own groups' particular rights and don't realize that it's the rights regime that needs to be protected. Let me shift over to Maria Lucia Uribe. And Maria Lucia, there's this, it seems to be a tendency right now to look at the immediate. I know there's so much uncertainty about COVID, it makes it impossible to plan for 3-6 months from now. The county school board telling me they're thinking about reopening, then they're not, and then maybe they'll have a few students in, and then they change their mind, and so planning in this space is incredibly hard. And I think society, political groups, community groups, student groups, everybody is kind of focused on tomorrow. But what is this going to look like 6 months or a year from now if we don't grapple with some of these questions about over 1.5 million students out of school, this question of economic impact and digital divide and children shifting into poverty? Where could we be a few years from now when these divisions grow? I mean, we hear a lot about the stock market. We hear about how it's at record highs. So there are some people whose wealth is growing exponentially, while there are many, many other people whose wealth is obviously retreating, and their opportunities are retracting as well. So tell us a little bit about how to look farther out and maybe start to plan a little more closer to where we are, but with this longer vision.
Thank you, James. That's a difficult question, but I believe that the point is that now, and I mean, we have 1.6 billion children that have been out of the school. And I think I made a mistake when I said billion children. And of course, that means that in the longer term, there are many, many impacts on their well-being related to others. What also Sarah mentioned is the digital divide, because most of the children, about 50% of the children that were out of school, they didn't have access to the internet, and therefore they were totally cut off from any education. And of course, this has a lot of implications. And then add to that, you have the violence at home, that many of these children were also victims of violence at home. And so this has also implications in their mental health. And now, I mean, what is the decision on reopening schools? I think what we see is that schools are protective places for children, are the places where children receive meals, are the places where children can share and express their feelings. They are places where at times they feel safer than at home. It's not always the case, of course, because children also experience bullying in school. Children also experience corporal punishment in school. So, at times it's difficult to say what is safer for them or not. But I would say that looking forward and in a more, futuristic way of thinking, I think that the emphasis should be on these community approaches. I think one of the things we have realized with the closure of schools is how disconnected education is from the community, how disconnected education is from the community safety nets that can surround children. So all these children that were cut off from education, there was no one who can help them. So we saw across the board with the teachers that we work with, teachers having to walk miles to be able to reach one child to bring some printed material for the child to do something at home. But what if religion could have played a role in supporting at the community level some children that were cut off from education? There were many alternatives to this, which are radio programs that proved successful in many cases, for example, with the Ebola outbreak in Africa. So radio programs, the use of WhatsApp groups. So I think there is a need to rethink how education can take place for those groups of children that have been cut off of education. But I think apart from there is how education connects to the community, the role that maybe faith communities can play, but also I would say the technology and the IT companies, because I think we are talking about and demanding governments to do something, but I think the telecommunication companies have a very important role to play in stepping up and saying, what can we do to support these children that are cut off? And I think that is an ethical demand. It's an ethical responsibility that we should demand governments to work more closely with IT companies, communities demanding and advocating for this, and of course looking at this in a more innovative and creative ways. I think a lot of the emphasis on education, James, has been on exams. And that has been throughout the board the preoccupation of many schools on exams. But education now has told us that we need to focus education to the well-being of children, to the social-emotional well-being, to create opportunities for children to be part of the solution, to develop projects in the community. That is a different way of learning, reading a text and repeating what the text says. So I think these are some clues, James, on how to look at education moving forward, but also the role that education has vis-a-vis community and the community it interacts with.
Yeah, what a great point. Turn to the business community as well. I mean, I think we look a lot to governments to develop responses, but we can't forget that some of these companies are so globalized. They are so trans-state that they can impact a huge swath of the human community without being sort of just connected to one particular state or one particular affected community in ways that could be really transformative. That's very true. There, of course, are the outstanding questions that the upcoming generation is already suffering a little bit from social separation because of its connectivity, and now that'll be amplified somewhat exponentially by increased dependence on tech and learning through and connecting to others through tech. I'm sure we feel it here. I certainly miss the opportunity to sit down face to face with you all in these spaces and share a cup of coffee and really have some in-depth conversations. And I'm sure that's going to be even more significant for my kids as they come up if this continues to have this kind of effect. But yeah, you're right. The technology companies could have this positive role to play in this. Victor, let me shift over to you and ask you. You have done, and I have witnessed URI's work. In fact, we have the pleasure of working now on a program on multi-faith efforts to address issues of conflict and other challenges. You really kind of operate in a space where religious difference is a source, I think, of creative inspiration to help different faith adherents understand their own values with creative insight from one another. I mean, it's a wonderful space that you've created at URI to do that, but that's not necessarily always the experience within faith traditions. Oftentimes, there's a focus on doctrinal difference and how that excludes us and separates us from one another. What are some of the things that you would recommend we try to do to emphasize that idea that we can learn from each other's spiritual aspirations in a way that push us all to try to create collective solutions for humanity rather than just turning inward to our own communities?
Thank you, James. There's a very simple exercise that I use with folks. It's a little hard to do in this virtual environment, but when I'm with people, again, we're not trying to bring institutions together or resolve theological conflicts. We're bringing people of different beliefs and cultures together to work on humanitarian issues in their communities. But the exercise is we sit in a circle, and in the middle of the circle is placed a box. And the box has different images on each side. And the question for the people in the circle is, how do you know what the box looks like? Now, there are two rules. One rule is you can't move from where you're sitting, because where you're sitting, this body that we inhabit, is a socially constructed perspective. We have perspectives that are framed by our life experience. And you can't move the box. So here we are sitting around in a circle and we're looking at this box. How do we know what the box looks like? How do we know how to engage this problem if the box represents a problem or an issue? The only way that we can construct an understanding of the box is if we listen to the experiences of everybody sitting around that circle. And together we construct understanding of, in this case, what the box looks like, or a problem to be solved, or an issue to be engaged. So each of our perspectives is valuable and partial. That's crucial in this work, that each of our perspectives is valuable, is unique, and partial, that we are unable on our own, whether it's individuals or as a community, as isolated communities, to address these issues without a collective construction of an understanding of what the issue is, and then a collective approach to problems solving. It challenges the very notion that in our individual belief communities, in our individual cultures, we are complete within ourselves, but rather we need each other. We need each other's perspectives, and in that case, diversity becomes an essential resource, not just an opportunity, and certainly not a resource for engaging these problems and for solving these issues. So that's where we start. We start from that perspective that we need each other, that we are incomplete and partial by ourselves, and it draws us into collaborative approach, whether it's to peace building, conflict transformation, whatever the issue is. It is the advantage of not working around bringing institutions together to reconcile, but rather human beings together in a circle in order to engage these issues.
Victor, thank you so much. I want to preempt my last panelist engagement by thanking everybody who's been involved in this. It's been an incredible panel. You all have such depth of wisdom and insight. I was kind of surprised that we had 2, but now I wish we had 4 or 5 hours for all of this. So again, what a wonderful time to spend with you all. Now let me turn finally to my good friend Mohammed Al-Sanusi. Mohammed, I don't have a specific question for you, but you know, I've seen you wander the halls of the religious world for years, engaging with some of the great faith leaders around the world. Can you share with us just one pearl of wisdom from all of that engagement, or from your own personal insights, that can inspire us going forward with just the last minute or 2 that we have?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, James. And of course, we heard a lot of wisdoms from my colleagues here in this panel. So really, there is not much to add. But really, a couple of things here to mention. One is that, Professor spoke about the consistency. And I will want to add to that the courage. So we have to have courage to reach to those who are vulnerable. And that's really very critical. And I have learned, especially in this, pandemic, or especially at the time of crisis, vulnerable people, you have to reach to them. Give you just a quick example. 6 years ago, James, when the crisis in Central African Republic, we went there only 3 basically months after the crisis. And the UN, our embassy there, telling us you can't go to PK5, you can't go to Kilometer 5, to the majority of the Muslim community, because it's a dangerous place. But I said, well, I need the courage to go there. But when I went there, I found there 35 imams waiting for me and for us to engage. And in the mosque, there were 4 bodies, dead bodies. They were not able to bury them because of security issues. but they needed that courage to discuss. But again, that bring me the importance of partnership. So I came back to my hotel and immediately got in touch with the UN and Red Cross and managed to bury these, dead bodies. So that courage to reach out to vulnerable people, I think, is so critical. So I want to just emphasize that. Second, also, we talked a lot, James, about religion. I want to also mention that, custom and tradition is critical. Those vulnerable people, they have their own custom and tradition, beautiful custom and tradition. We have to take that into consideration. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. That's wonderful. We absolutely need courage, and there are so many courageous people that we know and no one will ever hear from out there facing down some of these very hard trials, and they are the real heroes of the story. So thanks again. Let me pass that to Dima, who has coordinated this all for us, and thank you all, and many blessings to you all.
Thank you,
James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to all dear speakers and for all the rich interventions and the very rich following discussion.
Thank you to a fantastic moderator, genial moderator. Thank you, James.
Thank you.
If you may allow me to address also, to thank also our dear participants who've been actively engaged throughout the session. And I would like to remind them to fill in the evaluation form where the link has been shared over the chat. Please copy paste it into your browser. And also, as we wrap up today, the second day of the G20 Interfaith Forum, tomorrow we will continue to focus on another dimension of empowerment, the youth and women and the vulnerable groups. We're starting with a plenary and 3 parallel panel discussions delving more in depth on education empowerment, addressing the needs of migrants, and as well as structural inequalities. We thank you all once again for your valuable participation, and we look forward to connecting with you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.